Mr. Giraldo was in total darkness, the ground wet beneath him. He opened his eyes and had no idea where he was. Trees, shadows. The noise of the forest frightened him, and he could hear the distant sound of water running somewhere he couldn't locate. He tried to get up. His ribs protested with a dull, deep ache that spread up to his shoulder. He leaned back against the rock. How much time had passed? The light coming through the gaps in the canopy when he fell had still been late afternoon. Now there was no light at all. He closed his eyes, tried to remember. The stream. He had gone out to check the stream. The drought of the past few days had lowered the water level, and he needed to see it with his own eyes. He needed to. He had put it off for weeks, and that afternoon, without telling anyone, he took the path into the woods alone. The voice of Zé Pequeno came from somewhere in his memory. "Mr. Giraldo, leave it for tomorrow. It's getting dark early today." And the answer he had given, barely stopping as he walked, "I'll be right back. I'll be right back." The words seemed like a joke now. The wet rock on the stream bank had given no warning. 1 second he was standing, the next he was rolling down the slope, trying to grab branches that gave way, dirt that slipped through his fingers until the impact at the bottom. He hadn't lost consciousness, which was, in a way, worse. He felt everything. The blow to his ribs, the disorientation spinning inside his head like water in a bucket, and then came the mistake that couldn't be undone. He tried to find the trail on his own. For an hour, maybe 2, he walked in circles without knowing it. When night truly closed in, the forest had swallowed any reference point he could recognize. Mr. Giraldo was 74 years old, had high blood pressure, and the medication he should have taken at dusk was still on the kitchen counter. He felt his heart beat harder than normal, or maybe weaker. He couldn't tell anymore. He found the overhanging rock by accident, a minimal shelter, precarious, but some protection against the dew that was already starting to fall through the leaves. He leaned his back against the cold granite and stared into the nothingness ahead. The forest did not answer. He tried to shout one more time. His voice came out smaller than he wanted. It disappeared among the trees as if it had never existed. In the pocket of his plaid shirt, carefully folded, there was a photograph. Small, faded at the edges. A young man on a dark horse, smiling at someone outside the frame. He had put that photograph in his pocket that morning, as he did every time he went into the woods, an old habit, a personal talisman. The photograph was there. He was there. But no one knew where there was. And 2 kilometers away, in the dark pasture of the ranch, something had woken up. If you've ever felt that an animal understood you better than any person, you need to see what happens next. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell now. This story will change the way you see loyalty forever. Giraldo Meireles arrived at Cercado Ranch at 28 years old, with a debt in his name and a piece of land no one wanted. The neighbor who sold him the lot had laughed while signing the paper. "You'll go under in 2 years, kid. This land yields nothing." Giraldo folded the contract, put it in his pocket, and didn't answer. Not for lack of words, for an excess of determination. In the first months, he slept in a tarp shack while building the walls of the farmhouse with his own hands. He learned to work with the silent hardness of someone who has no other option. He opened the spring that fed the stream with a hoe and patience, centimeter by centimeter under the scorching sun. He planted, lost crops, planted again. That went on for years. Teresa appeared at a St. John's festival in town, dancing with a grace he could never explain to anyone afterward. They married a year later. She arrived at the ranch with a small suitcase and a smile that made the dust of the savannah look beautiful. In the years that followed, it was her and Giraldo against everything: the drought, the debt, the distance from any large city, the years when the cattle didn't cover the costs. And still, the ranch grew. The corral he built alone gained a second section. The herd that started with 4 head reached 40 in the prosperous years. The children were born, Renato the oldest, then Claudia, and grew up running among the fences, learning the names of the plants, the smell of wet earth after the rain. Geraldo taught by example, as his father had taught him, not with speeches, but with hands at work before the sun rose. There was a photograph taken on one of those mornings, a young man on a dark horse, smiling at someone outside the frame. Teresa was the one holding the camera. She had called out his name, and when he turned, she captured exactly that instant. Him, whole, unaware he was being seen. Geraldo had put that photograph in his shirt pocket the next day, and he never lost the habit, but years are kind to no one. Renato was the first to leave. He got a position at a company in São Paulo at 22 and left without looking back much. "Dad, there's no future for me here." Claudia left 2 years later. Marriage, moving to Belo Horizonte. The visits grew more spaced out. Christmas of 2022 was the last time both were at the ranch together. Geraldo never complained out loud. He was never one to complain. But Teresa felt it. She always felt what he didn't say. She was the one who kept the house smelling of warm food when the ranch hands came in from the fields. She was the one who knew when Geraldo was worried about the finances just by the way he drank his coffee, too slowly, staring into space. She was the one who, every afternoon, would take a sugar cube and go to the pasture fence to offer it to the dark horse none of the hands would approach. "That animal is just like you, Geraldo," she would say. "He just needs someone who isn't in a hurry." When Teresa left on a June evening 3 years ago, the ranch became too big, not in size, in silence. Geraldo started waking up earlier because there was no reason to stay in bed. He started eating dinner standing at the sink because setting the table for one took more effort than it seemed. The hands came, worked, left. The herd shrank to a number he could manage alone. The land remained steadfast. That, at least, had abandoned no one. But Renato's calls grew shorter, and in one of them a few months ago, his son's voice had a tone Geraldo recognized even before the words arrived. "Dad, we need to talk about this ranch. You're 74. You're alone. The other day you even told me your blood pressure was up. There's a good place near here, Dad. Modern. You'd adjust." Geraldo was silent for a long time. Then he hung up. Not out of anger, because he had no words that came close to what he felt, which was the same thing any man feels when he realizes his son sees his life as a problem to be solved. That afternoon, without saying a word to anyone, he went to check the stream, and the stream had returned him to the ground of a forest that now would not yield a path. Mr. Geraldo's ranch was not at the end of the world, but almost. 52 kilometers of road separate Cercado Ranch from the town, 23 of them unpaved. On rainy days, the last stretch turns into a mud pit that would swallow any ordinary car. This had always been a point of pride for Geraldo. The distance kept the noise of the world away. But distance, over time, exacts a price that doesn't show up on any bill. The health post that served the region had ended its home visit service at the beginning of the previous year. Lack of funds, they said. The doctor who visited the farms and ranches once a month simply stopped coming. To get his blood pressure medication, Geraldo had to catch the bus that passed at 6 in the morning, arrive in town, wait in line, and return on the only afternoon bus when there was a seat. Some weeks he delayed. He took what he had saved and made a mental note that he needed to get it sorted out. No one from the town hall called to ask how the rural residents were managing. Renato called. Sometimes. The conversations had become functional. "You okay, Dad? Need anything, Dad? Watch your blood pressure, Dad," without ever going below the surface. It was the kind of attention that doesn't warm. On Geraldo's last birthday, his son sent a bank transfer and a short message. "Happy birthday. Buy something you want." Geraldo didn't buy anything. He didn't know how to answer that question. Claudia, his daughter, had her own problems. 2 young children, a husband who traveled for work, a routine that left no room. She called less often than Renato. When she called, the conversation was affectionate, short, and ended with her promising to visit soon. Soon had become an expression Geraldo stopped putting on the calendar. At the ranch, the 2 hands hired at the start of the year did their work competently. Braulio, the older one, was efficient and silent. He arrived, did what was agreed, left. He never asked how Geraldo was doing. It wasn't meanness. It was just his way. Zé Pequeno, the younger, was 23 and always had his phone in his hand during free moments. He was polite, helpful when asked, but lived in a world parallel to the ranch, the world of the screen, messages, short videos. He looked at Geraldo the way you look at a familiar landscape, present, but not truly seen. And there was thunder. Neither of the 2 men approached the dark horse unless absolutely necessary. Braulio would go around the corral on the longer side of the fence to avoid passing close. Zé Pequeno, in one of his first weeks, tried to enter the pasture to grab a tool, and thunder turned sharply in his direction. Didn't advance, didn't threaten, just turned. But Zé Pequeno ran away just the same. After that, they left the horse for Geraldo to deal with. Thunder stayed in the corner of the pasture, alone as always. While the days passed and the stream level dropped, and Geraldo wrote in an old notebook the string of concerns he had no one to share with, the dark horse stood still near the old wooden fence, the one Geraldo kept putting off fixing. There was always something more urgent, and stared at the edge of the woods like someone waiting for something they couldn't name. Indifference doesn't need intention to hurt. Sometimes it's just the silence everyone accepted as normal. And while no one noticed that Mr. Geraldo hadn't returned that afternoon, thunder was restless in a way none of the hands could name. Night in the forest does not arrive slowly. In the Minas Gerais savanna, when the sun disappears behind the mountain ranges, darkness closes in all at once, as if someone has pulled a thick curtain over the world. There is no long twilight. There is light, and then there is night. And night has weight. Mr. Geraldo felt that weight in his ribs, not just the pain from the fall, which continued to throb with every deeper breath. It was something else. It was the damp cold rising from the forest floor and seeping through his plaid shirt as if the fabric weren't there. It was the dew already dripping from the higher leaves and falling onto his face in irregular drops without warning. It was his body telling him, with the dry clarity only the body has, that this couldn't last the whole night. He knew what was happening with his blood pressure. He didn't need a device to measure it. He felt it behind his eyes, a dull, constant pressure that pulsed differently than normal. The medication was on the kitchen counter, a small blue box next to the aluminum cup Teresa had bought at a street fair over 20 years ago. Geraldo took the pill every day at 6 o'clock without fail. It was the only appointment he never forgot. It was perhaps 9 o'clock now, maybe later. He tried to reorganize his thoughts. Strategy, direction. The stream was below, that he knew. If he descended following the sound of water, he would reach the bank. From the bank, he knew the way. But the sound of water had disappeared hours ago. Either he had strayed too far, or his hearing was failing, or the trees absorbed the noise in a way he had never noticed before. He tried to stand up. His ribs told him to sit back down. He stayed still, breathed through his nose, counted to 4. The pain didn't go away, but it stayed at a level he could ignore if he didn't try to move too fast. At some point, he heard a bark, distant, muffled by the forest, but a bark. Geraldo filled his lungs and shouted with all the strength his ribs allowed. The name of the ranch, Zé Pequeno's name, anything. His voice came out hoarse, smaller than he expected, and dissolved among the trunks without finding anything. The bark did not return. Silence. Only the dripping of dew and his own heart, which continued beating at a rhythm he didn't like. Geraldo stared into the darkness ahead. The forest he had known since his 30s, that he had crossed on horseback hundreds of times, that he had taught to his children when they were small, that he had respected and always been careful to announce his entry, was now completely indifferent to his presence. It was just woods. It was just night. The thoughts came without asking permission. The photo in his shirt pocket, Teresa holding the camera calling his name, the ranch he had built, centimeter by centimeter, the stream he had opened in dry earth, the corral, the smell of wet earth after the rain, things he had built that would continue to exist with or without him. Without him. The word landed with a weight he hadn't expected. He took the photo from his pocket carefully and held it in his hand, not looking. Just held it, as if the faded paper had its own warmth. "Teresa," he said very quietly, almost without sound, "I don't think I'm coming home tonight." It wasn't despair. It was just the honesty of a man who had spent his whole life facing what was real. And what was real at that moment said the cold would get worse, his blood pressure was high, his ribs wouldn't improve, and no one knew where he was. He closed his eyes, and then, from somewhere in the direction of the ranch, came a sound he hadn't expected, a sharp crack, wood breaking under weight. Wood breaking, then silence again, but a different silence. Thunder was born in a place where no one had patience. The breeding farm where he spent his first years was the kind of place that treats an animal like a tool, useful when it works, disposable when it causes trouble. And Thunder caused trouble, not because he was aggressive by nature, but because no one had taken the time to understand what was behind that defensive behavior, that gaze that assessed everything before allowing any approach. The rope that left the scar on his left neck was thick, made of sisal. He was 3 years old when they tied him too tight for too long, for no reason that made sense to anyone but the one who tied him. The scar remained, and with it a memory that needs no words to stay alive. He passed through 2 ranches before arriving at Cercado. At both, the conclusion was the same: problem horse. No one rides him. No one can work with him. Better to get rid of him. That's how he arrived at Cercado Ranch at 10 years old, thin, wary, with a reputation that preceded him. Geraldo heard everything they had to say about the animal, and the next day he went to the pasture, sat on the wooden fence, and stayed quiet. He brought no halter, no saddle. He came with no intention other than to be there. Thunder stayed on the other side of the pasture, watching with that gaze that measured everything. Geraldo looked at the mountain range on the horizon and stayed. An hour, maybe more. That's how it went the following week and the next. Teresa asked what he was doing. Geraldo answered without taking his eyes off the fence, waiting for him to decide he doesn't need to be afraid. She shook her head with the smile of someone who had already learned not to question her husband's logic. It took 3 months, not 3 weeks, 3 months, until Thunder approached for the first time on his own, sniffed the sleeve of Geraldo's shirt, and stood beside the fence as if that were the most natural thing in the world. From that day on, it was different, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, solid way like things that last. Thunder accepted the saddle without resistance. Not the first time, but when the time came, he accepted. He became the most reliable of the herd. He knew the way to every part of the property. He never threw Geraldo, never backed up on a bridge, on a difficult stretch, on a stormy day. The new hands didn't know this story. They saw the dark horse with the scar on his neck and saw a problem. Braulio went around. Zé Pequeno fled. Thunder stayed in the corner of the pasture, ignored, without a regular rider, since Geraldo's health had started showing signs that those long rides were no longer sensible. He was a horse who had found his place in the world, and who, in recent years, had seen that place grow quieter and quieter. Then came that night. What exactly happened inside Thunder during those hours, no one can say for certain. What is known is what the eyes saw. In the early hours of the morning, the dark horse moved through the pasture with a determination that was anything but random. He went straight to the old wooden fence, the same one Geraldo kept putting off fixing, and pushed with his chest until the dry crack cut through the silence of the night. The fence gave way. Thunder stepped over the broken boards without hesitation and disappeared into the direction of the forest. Zé Pequeno was not the kind of man who believed in omens. He was 23, grew up in a small town, learned to work the land out of necessity rather than vocation, and saw the world with the straightforward pragmatism of someone who hadn't yet lived long enough to have his certainties broken. When Braulio arrived early in the morning and found the broken fence and Thunder missing, the older man's first reaction was pragmatic. Horse ran off. Need to find him before he disappears into the woods. But it was Zé Pequeno who found Thunder. He was at the edge of the ranch, standing at the entrance of the trail that led into the forest. He wasn't grazing. He wasn't walking. He was standing still, neck raised, looking into the woods, as if reading something written among the trees that no human could see. Zé Pequeno approached slowly, not out of courage, out of curiosity. That horse he had always avoided, that had always seemed like a bundle of tension on four legs, was completely still. Different. As if all that energy that normally radiated outward was now pointed in one direction only. Thunder! The horse didn't turn. He kept looking at the forest. It was then that Zé Pequeno noticed the other thing. Mr. Geraldo hadn't appeared for breakfast. The cup he left on the edge of the stove every morning was clean, dry in its usual place, untouched. Zé Pequeno looked at the horse, looked at the woods, looked back at the horse. "You know where he is?" Thunder took a step onto the trail, stopped, looked back. It wasn't a story Zé Pequeno would be able to tell later without sounding crazy. But there was something about the way that animal stopped and waited that left no choice but to follow. He followed. Thunder moved slowly. He didn't gallop, didn't trot. He walked with a deliberation that seemed calculated, stopping at intervals to check if Zé Pequeno was still behind him. When the young ranch hand stumbled on a root or lost his rhythm, the horse waited. Without impatience, without hurry, just waited, and when the footsteps resumed, he moved forward again. Zé Pequeno had never gone that deep into those woods. At some point, as they walked through a more open stretch, he got close enough to Thunder to see the scar on the horse's left neck clearly, that wide line of different fur that ran along the neck muscle like an ancient relief. He had seen it before, from a distance, and always associated it with the idea of danger, of a problematic animal. Up close, it looked like something else. It looked like the mark of something that had been done to him, not something he had done. Zé Pequeno didn't yet have words for that thought. It was just a feeling, raw and new, that stayed with him as he kept walking behind the dark horse through the dense forest. They went almost 2 kilometers. Thunder stopped in a spot where the vegetation closed in tighter, near a rock formation Zé Pequeno had never seen. He stood motionless, and then Zé Pequeno heard it, a voice, weak, hoarse, but human, coming from beneath an overhanging rock a few meters ahead. "Is someone there?" Zé Pequeno ran. He found Mr. Geraldo leaning against the granite, his shirt damp with dew, his face pale but his eyes open, conscious, alive, a small faded photograph clutched in his right hand. "Zé," the old man's voice came out with a relief that was almost unbearable to hear. "I knew someone would come." Zé Pequeno knelt beside his boss. He was breathing short, his knees trembling, not sure if it was from exertion or from something else he didn't yet have a name for. He looked back. Thunder was standing 3 meters away, quiet, looking at Geraldo with that total attention that Zé Pequeno now recognized as something other than danger. It was 10 years of history he was seeing for the first time. Thousands of people are watching this video right now. If this story moved you, leave the name of your city in the comments. You'll be surprised how many people who think like you are closer than you imagine. Geraldo stayed in bed for 2 days, not by choice. The doctor Zé Pequeno called in the morning. A clinician from town who came to the ranch for the first time in years was direct. "You're lucky to be here, Mr. Geraldo. Blood pressure at this level, cold all night, bruised ribs. This could have ended very differently." He prescribed rest, adjusted the medication, and before leaving spoke quietly with Zé Pequeno on the porch, thinking Geraldo couldn't hear from the bedroom. Geraldo heard. "He can't keep living alone like this. Anything could happen." Zé Pequeno didn't answer, but he was the one who called Renato. His son arrived 2 days later by car with a small suitcase and that look of someone who has already decided what he's going to say before he arrives. He hugged his father with excessive care, as if hugging something fragile that might break. He sat at the kitchen table, put both elbows on the wood, and started with the controlled voice of someone who had rehearsed in the car. "Dad, you almost died in the middle of the woods because of a stream. Do you understand how serious that is?" Geraldo drank his coffee without answering. "I already looked into a place in Contargem. Modern, Dad. They have a doctor on site, activities, people your age. You'd adjust well. I'm 74, Renato, not 90. Dad, this conversation is over." Renato didn't leave the next day as planned. He stayed. And by staying, he began to observe the ranch with that look of someone calculating what can be done with something that no longer works as it should. That was when he noticed Thunder. There was something about that dark horse, with the scar on his neck, roaming loose in the pasture as if he owned the place, that bothered the son. He called Braulio to talk. Braulio, who had never needed much encouragement to voice his opinion on Thunder, was objective. "Old horse, no use for work, and he broke the fence. That fence is going to cost about 300 reais for new wood plus labor. And there's the risk. An animal with that history isn't trustworthy." Renato made a mental note. The next day, a veterinarian arrived. Not called by Geraldo, called by Renato without warning. A competent man in a lab coat who examined Thunder from a distance with the professional objectivity of someone evaluating an animal like you'd evaluate an engine. He measured, observed, checked the age. 15 years for a working horse is already advanced age, he said, writing on his notepad. No defined function, no regular rider, loose in the pasture. That's not quality of life. I'd recommend a retirement facility. There's a good one in this region that takes in animals like this. Geraldo, who had come out of the bedroom without asking anyone's permission, was standing on the porch, listening to everything. Retirement? He repeated the word slowly, as if chewing something with a bad taste. This horse left the pasture in the middle of the night and guided Zé Pequeno to me in the dense forest. And you're telling me he needs retirement? The veterinarian adjusted his glasses. "Sir, I understand the attachment, but from a technical standpoint, thank you for coming." That was the end of the conversation, but it wasn't the end of the problem. Renato that afternoon made a unilateral decision he deemed reasonable. He had Thunder put in the stable. "For safety," he said, "until things settled down." Braulio carried it out without question. It was the first time in years Thunder was confined between 4 walls. Geraldo found out half an hour later and went to the stable without saying a word to anyone. He stood outside the closed door for a long time. He didn't open it. He just stood there, listening to the horse moving in the small space, hide rubbing against wood, hooves stamping restlessly on the packed dirt floor. He went back to the bedroom. He didn't sleep that night. His blood pressure, which had started to ease, went back up. The doctor confirmed it the next morning, without needing to ask why. Geraldo didn't explain. He lay staring at the ceiling with that closed expression Teresa used to recognize from a distance, and the children never learned to read. Zé Pequeno passed by the stable at the end of the day, carrying feed. He stopped in front of the door, looked through the gap. Thunder was standing in the center of the space, facing the wall, quiet, but with a contained tension in his entire body that Zé Pequeno recognized, not as aggression, as waiting. It was the same way the animal had stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the woods before everything happened. Zé Pequeno put the feed in the trough without saying anything and left. But he thought about it all night. Renato left on Thursday, not the way he had arrived, with plans and certainties and a list of things to resolve. He left in a quieter manner, more like a retreat than a goodbye. On the morning before he left, he sat again at the kitchen table with his father and didn't talk about nursing homes or sales or veterinarians. He drank his coffee, looked out the window at the pasture, and then said, almost unwillingly, "This ranch is still beautiful, Dad." Geraldo didn't answer, but he let his son's hand squeeze his arm without pulling away. The day after Renato left, Geraldo got up before sunrise, put on his sandals, crossed the porch still in the dimness of dawn, and went straight to the stable. He opened the door without ceremony. "That's enough," he said into the darkness inside. Thunder stepped out slowly, sniffing the cold morning air. He stopped beside Geraldo for a moment, side by side, the two looking out at the pasture in the light that hadn't fully arrived yet. Then the horse walked across the yard and went into the open field as if he had never left. Geraldo stood in the same spot for a long time. Braulio arrived for work that day and found the stable open, Thunder loose in the pasture, and Geraldo sitting on the new wooden fence, the one that had been repaired after the night of the rescue, with his arms crossed on the fence posts, looking at the horizon. His posture was the same as 10 years earlier, when he used to sit waiting for a distrustful horse to decide the world wasn't entirely hostile. Braulio didn't say anything. He went to do his work. But that afternoon, when he finished his tasks, he passed by the pasture instead of going around it. He didn't approach Thunder, he just walked along the inside of the fence, a path that was slightly shorter. A small thing, almost imperceptible, but different. Zé Pequeno was the one who changed the most. There was something those 2 kilometers inside the forest had done to him that he still couldn't quite name. It wasn't exactly admiration, it was more like respect. The kind of respect that comes when you understand you judge something by its appearance and were wrong in a way that matters. He started bringing Thunder's feed with his own hand, putting it in the trough without hurry, without that instinctive recoil from before. Thunder watched him, assessed, and accepted. One Wednesday afternoon, almost 3 weeks after the rescue, Zé Pequeno extended his open hand toward the horse, holding nothing, just an open palm. Thunder sniffed, touched it with his muzzle, walked away. For someone who had run away from a mere glance from the animal, that was a vast distance traveled. The story of the horse who had guided the ranch hand to the lost farmer had spread through the region with the speed that only true stories have. In a community where everyone knows everyone, the kind of thing that happened at Cercado Ranch doesn't stay secret for long. Neighbors crossing the dirt road would slow down when they spotted Geraldo on the porch. They'd stop the car, ask how he was doing. One of them asked if he could see the horse. He had heard about it, wanted to see it with his own eyes. Geraldo took the man to the pasture without much fuss. Thunder was in his usual corner, dark coat shining in the afternoon sun. The neighbor stood looking for a long time, in silence. "That's him," he said finally, as if needing to confirm it to himself. "Looks normal." "He is normal," Geraldo replied. "It's just that no one stopped to look properly before." The photograph that had been in his shirt pocket that night came out of the pocket for the last time. Geraldo put it in a simple wooden frame, the kind you buy at any small-town market, unpretentious, and hung it on the porch wall beside the door. a young man on a dark horse, smiling at someone outside the frame. Teresa had been the one calling his name. Now the photograph stayed there, in the spot where the afternoon breeze always arrived first, facing the pasture where thunder grazed at the end of the day. Geraldo started sitting on the porch again at dusk, started taking his medication at 6 o'clock without fail again, started being the man who knew where he was again. But there was one thing he still hadn't said to Thunder, and the right moment was still to come. It was an afternoon in April that Geraldo went to the pasture for the last time with something in his pocket. It wasn't the photograph. The photograph already had its place on the porch wall, framed in the evening breeze. It was something else, smaller, white, which he had taken from the sugar bowl in the kitchen carefully, like someone taking something that belongs to another time. A sugar cube. He walked slowly across the yard, opened the pasture gate without hurry, and called in a normal voice without forcing it, "Thunder!" The horse was in his usual corner, raised his head, stood still for a moment, that ancient assessment, that gaze that measured before deciding. Then he began to walk toward Geraldo, with that broad, easy stride that only animals who have nothing to prove possess. He stopped a meter away. Geraldo opened his hand slowly, the white cube in the center of his palm, the same way Teresa used to do, with her hand completely open, fingers not closed, holding nothing. "That way he knows there's no trick," she used to say. "An open hand is an honest hand." Thunder lowered his muzzle, sniffed, took the sugar with a care that didn't match the size of the animal, that delicate touch of lips that seems impossible coming from such a large creature. Geraldo kept his hand extended for a moment, even after the cube was gone. Then he slowly raised his hand and ran his palm along the side of the horse's neck, over the scar, that wide line of different fur he had touched hundreds of times over 10 years, but never with this new awareness, this different weight of knowing what the animal had done with everything that had been done to him. "This is what Teresa used to bring you," he said quietly. "Every afternoon. You remember her?" It wasn't a question. Thunder leaned his neck lightly against Geraldo's hand, a small gesture, subtle, the kind that those who aren't paying attention don't see. Geraldo paid attention. "You waited for someone to come back too." The words came out unplanned, but when they came out, Geraldo knew they were the right ones. They were the only ones that came close to what was between the two of them. That thing without a name that isn't ownership, isn't utility, isn't what most people think when they think of a man and a horse. It was recognition, the kind that takes years to build and needs no words to exist. Zé Pequeno was on the threshold of the tool shed, about 20 meters away, pretending to fix a tool. He wasn't fixing anything. He was watching that scene with the silence of someone who understands he is seeing something that won't be repeated. It was the first time he had seen his boss cry. Not desperate crying. The silent, almost imperceptible kind that escapes when emotion is too big for the body to hold without warning. Zé Pequeno didn't approach. He didn't need to. That night, after dinner, Geraldo picked up his phone and called Renato. His son answered on the second ring with that slightly tense voice of someone always expecting bad news when his father calls outside of normal hours. But there was no bad news. "Renato, I just wanted to say I'm fine. The ranch is fine." A pause. "And that you could come by. Not to fix anything, just to come by." On the other end, silence. Then, "I'll be there next month, Dad." This time Geraldo put the date on the calendar. Thunder's scar was still there, but the way people looked at it had changed forever. There is a kind of loyalty that cannot be taught. It isn't born from training, doesn't come from obligation, doesn't respond to commands. It stays stored in silence inside those who are treated with genuine patience and waits. Sometimes it waits for years, and when the moment comes, it doesn't ask permission. It simply acts. Those bound to Geraldo by blood were 52 kilometers away, asleep. The system that was supposed to care for him had closed the home visit post due to lack of funds. And the only living being that broke a fence in the middle of the night to go to him was an animal the world had discarded as problematic. I'll take that. I'll take the image of Thunder standing at the edge of that forest alone, in the dark, with no one having asked anything of him. I find myself thinking about how many times I looked at someone marked by what life had done to them. The visible scar, the defensive behavior, the mistrust that looks like arrogance from afar, and turned away. Not out of cruelty, out of haste, out of not wanting the work of understanding what was behind it. Thunder had every reason in the world to stay in the pasture, not to trust, to let the night resolve what the night had created. But he went, and I ask myself, with an honesty that sometimes hurts, how many fences have I failed to break? And you? When was the last time someone waited for you without asking anything in return? When was the last time you went without asking permission, without guarantees, without knowing if it would help? The story of Geraldo and Thunder is not about an extraordinary horse. It is about what happens when someone decides that the kindness they received will not die inside them. It is about what patience builds when the whole world has given up on building. It is about the choice to go, even when staying would be easier. Do not abandon. Return. On that April afternoon, there was a 74-year-old man standing in the pasture with an open hand and a sugar cube that belonged to a memory. There was a dark horse with a scar on his neck approaching slowly, not because he needed to, but because he recognized. And there was a photograph on the porch wall, a young man smiling at someone outside the frame, on a day when the future still had no shape. Geraldo's hand passed over Thunder's scar, and in that simple, silent gesture, with no audience, was everything that mattered. The account settled between two beings who had learned, each in their own way and in their own time, that trusting again is the most courageous act there is. The scar was still there, but a scar is never just what hurts. It is also proof that you survived.